Hi everyone, welcome to Bold Conjectures with Paras Chopra. Today I am with Antti Revonsuo, a cognitive neuroscientist who's interested in understanding consciousness as a purely biological phenomena. He believes we shouldn't invoke unnecessary metaphysics until we've given a good shot at understanding consciousness fully in biological terms. Currently, he's a professor of cognitive neuroscience at the University of Hovode in Sweden. I apologize for the name pronunciation again. And of psychology at the University of Turku in Finland. His work focuses on altered states of consciousness in general and dreaming in particular. He's best known for his threat simulation theory, which states that dreams serve as a biological function of rehearsing possibly threatening situations in order to aid survival, and it's connected with evolution. Um, uh, uh, Professor Revonsuo is an advocate of dreaming brain as a model of consciousness, and he's written a book on the same, which I've thoroughly enjoyed, and I have it with me. It's just full of notes. Uh, each and every chapter of the book blew my mind in a different way. It's so good. So I'm very excited for today, where we'll spend the next hour or so talking about how consciousness can be understood biologically and what role dreams play in that pursuit. Welcome, Professor. Thanks for taking out time today.
Thank you for your kind invitation and for your introduction. And I'm very pleased and honored to be here and to talk about, well, my favorite topics, consciousness and dreaming and everything relating to that. So I'm very happy to be here.
Fantastic. So I wanted to begin with talking about why are you interested in consciousness? It's as broad as question can get. What aspects of consciousness, it makes you so deeply interested in it?
Yeah, I think it was actually dreaming that triggered my interest at first. I mean, at a purely personal level, because already as a teenager, I had some very curious dreams where I didn't know what to call them at that point, but now I know they would be called like false awakenings. So you think you have woken up and you get out from the bed and you start to do stuff, and then later on you wake up again. And then you realize, hey, where was I just a moment ago? Because it was just a dream. You were just dreaming of waking up, or lucid dreaming that you realized in the dream, or that you were asking the question that, hey, what's going on? That can this be really happening? Is this a dream? And then after these dreams, I was really wondering about them. And I was wondering, so where was I? What was that place where I was asking the question that is this real or is this a dream? Because it really felt so real. So that triggered my interest in the fundamental nature of dreaming. And then when I was a student of psychology and philosophy, I encountered Thomas Nagel's classical paper on what is it like to be a bat. So the famous question of, can science really understand and explain consciousness? And in his famous paper, he beautifully characterizes what the real problem is. It's the subjectivity of consciousness, that consciousness is what it feels like for us to exist in this world. So it's a being in the world experience that always feels like something. And then I was very interested in science and psychology and all sorts of things. And then it struck me that, hey, here is a mystery. This is a real mystery. That is this where the limits of science, are we somehow looking at the limits of science, like Nagel argued in that famous paper? And that really, I was always interested in mysteries. So that really somehow caught my attention and my curiosity. And then I started to focus more and more on the problem of consciousness. But I always had in the back of my mind that I would also like to do some kind of dream research because of my personal previous interests in dreaming. So I think those two were somehow combined in my later work, the question of the fundamental nature of dreaming, and then the question of the fundamental nature of consciousness, and are we really at the limits of science when we try to explain those?
Right. I echo your interest in consciousness. I think I find it equally baffling, perhaps, as baffling as the question, why does the universe exist or what is reality? It seems one of the last big unexplored territories for science. Uh, but there are respected philosophers, I'm sure you are aware of Daniel Dennett and others, who call this an illusion and who believe there's nothing to explain. So, can you perhaps lay down their argument and tell me about why you don't agree with them, why this mystery is real and worth explaining?
Yes, definitely. And actually, when I started to, in the 1990s, I started to participate in like seriously in the study of consciousness. Daniel Dennett and these philosophers in the same kind of camp were the first ones who I encountered. Both, I mean, Dennett has written a lot about consciousness, but he has also written about dreaming. And I was really kind of confused and sort of disappointed, because I thought that there I will find the answers to what is the fundamental nature of these very mysterious phenomena. But when I was reading like Dennett's philosophy, then I gradually realized that although he kind of seems to attack both dreaming and consciousness somehow directly, the answers that he gives are, for me at least, they were very unsatisfactory, because it seemed to me that he's actually denying the whole problem, or arguing that it's a pseudo problem, that actually the only thing that we have scientifically for Dennett is the reports. I mean, how people describe their conscious experiences, how people describe their dreams, that's the only data that science can study. But according to Dennett, we can't thereby assume that somewhere inside the brain there is an actual phenomenon that resembles these reports that we get. And when I was studying Dennett's philosophy more, I understood where his roots are in sort of like philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, that he represented, and his teachers had represented, what we know as the tradition of logical behaviorism and functionalism, which basically is the idea that science only can study things that we can objectively observe, so that they are publicly observable phenomena, and that was the dominating idea in both philosophy and psychology from the 1930s to 1960s or 70s, and then I realized that this is not really, it's outdated, that now we already have so much more data about what consciousness really is, what dreaming really is, that we can't go on denying that they are real. And I could see that, for example, these philosophers, that they were not really aware of all the data that dream research had produced, that we can see that the brain is internally highly active while we are asleep, in REM sleep especially, and obviously going through similar states, internal states, like we are during wakefulness. So I thought we have good objective evidence for arguing that there are, inside the brain, there is actually all this colorful, eventful phenomenology going on in some sort of a dream world, for example, during dreaming. And if you deny that phenomenon, you have to deny a lot of the actual evidence, or you have to kind of try to explain it away like Dennett does. And then I started to argue against the Dennettian positions that try to eliminate consciousness, or try to argue that consciousness is merely a pseudo problem. And I used dreaming as a model system and a metaphor, because dreaming is kind of an ultimately subjective phenomenon. So that we all know, I mean, anyone who has had a dream, and I would say that's 99% of the population who know what we are talking about when we talk about dreaming and dream experiences. Anyone who has had a dream knows that it feels, and it can feel, very real, super real, even in very vivid dream experiences. So it's impossible to really deny that those experiences exist. And And now we can, if we use dreaming as a model for consciousness, we can get rid of these, like these kind of behavioristic ideas that you always need to have externally observable behavior, or you have always some kind of external stimulation, because there is none of that during dreaming. We can have a very vivid conscious experience, very strong experiences during dreaming, but they are not related to what's going on in the outside world. Our body is just lying there, and nobody looking at our bodies while we are dreaming can say anything about our experiences. So they are ultimately subjective. And then I thought that, well, in some sense, dreaming is the phenomenon that really crystallizes the core of the problem of consciousness. That if we can explain dreaming, and if we can take dreaming seriously, then we are taking the core of consciousness seriously. So that was my line of argument against Dennett. And I argue that it's very implausible position now to claim that dreams are just some kind of illusions, or like Dennett tried to argue that we are actually having false memories. That when we wake up, we have this false memory that we were in the middle of some colorful adventure, and then we tell a story about it. We give a dream report, but nothing like that actually happened as an experience. That was Dennett's line of argument. But I thought that's highly implausible, and therefore we need to have a more plausible account of dreaming that takes dreaming as a real phenomenon, and then also use that as the basis for explaining consciousness as a whole.
Right. To summarize, say behaviorism and the argument why consciousness is illusion. So the basic argument is that if you touch something hot and you move your hand away from it, you're not really feeling pain. It's biologically evolved illusion, so that you end up surviving. But your argument is that in dreams, nothing particularly from an external behavior perspective happens, and yet we have reports of such rich experiences that they must be real.
Yeah, exactly. And then dream research and sleep research has produced evidence that they are not just some false memories, that we know now from measurements of the brain and behavior during sleep, that our muscles are paralyzed, and that actually our motor cortex, for example, is very active, so that it is generating these hallucinatory movements, so to speak, that never reaches our muscles because our muscles are paralyzed, and also that our visual cortex is also active. So we have all the reasons to believe that these activities in the brain are exactly capable of generating this kind of phenomenology, and not just creating some kind of false memories that we had some experiences.
Right. I was very amazed at reading one of the experiments you had described, where the dreamer communicated with researchers using eye movements. That particularly goes against the false narrative story as an explanation, where if you're communicating while the person is dreaming, then obviously something real is happening.
Exactly. That was also one of the that I found most interesting. So you're talking about lucid dreaming, and so lucid dreaming is a dream where the dreamer knows that it's a dream, and you can voluntarily control your actions, and you can remember facts from your waking life. And sleep researchers did not actually believe that lucid dreaming is a real phenomenon either in the 1970s. Okay. They still thought that the person wakes up momentarily and then falls back asleep very quickly, and during that few seconds of being awake, they have this thought that this is a dream. But then some researchers, especially Stephen LaBerge, he devised this experiment that he was teaching lucid dreamers to have an action plan, that when they become lucid and they are sleeping in a sleep lab, that when they have this idea that, hey, this is a dream, I'm dreaming, they will signal this by moving their eyes in a certain way, and we can record this. So we get a signal from the dream world that, hey, this person is currently inside the dream world, and is giving us a signal from there. And I thought that was really amazing. And eventually that kind of data, when it was replicated and confirmed, it led for sleep researchers and the whole kind of more objective sleep research community to accept that lucid dreaming is a real phenomenon that happens during REM sleep. Because you could also see in the EEG that the person was fully in REM sleep at the time when they were signaling that now they realize they are dreaming. And actually, just this year earlier, there was a sort of a further new discovery about lucid dreaming, because now there was one study that was published, I think in Nature Neuroscience, in one of the leading science journals anyway, where the researchers were able to also communicate with the dreamer, so that they could send questions into the dream world, and the dreamer was answering those questions by moving their eyes in a certain way. So a kind of a two-way communication channel to the dream world. And this is, you could say that this kind of evidence also is kind of like the final nail into the coffin of those kinds of theories that claim that we have no access to dreaming except reports that were given when the person was already awake. Now we can, in some sense, in of course still limited sense, but we can get dream reports from the dreamer while the dream is still happening, and that certainly proves that the dream is kind of like a real phenomenon that happens there in the sleeping brain, and not some kind of post hoc invention by the awakening brain.
Right. I mean, this sounds so beautiful, two-way communication with the dreamer. It just almost sounds like an alien contact, because you're having a conversation with an entirely different universe. I mean, the dream universe that doesn't really exist. I don't know why I'm so fascinated with this idea where the dream world is as real as this world. And I think this is the same thing you talk about when you talk about the world simulation metaphor. So can you talk about in what way even our waking sort of life, even right now where we are having a communication over Zoom, it's a simulation?
Yes. So like I mentioned, I took dreaming to be a sort of a model system to understand consciousness, and first in my work I tried to come up with what is really a proper definition of dreaming as a phenomenon, and I came up with a concept of virtual reality and world simulation, that we should define dreaming by referring to those kinds of concepts and leave out maybe some simpler types of experiences, because there can also be very simple experiences while we are asleep, and these we can call sleep mentation. So you can have, like, let's say, you can have one word or one sentence or maybe one melody or a song running in your mind's ear while you're asleep, or you can maybe see like an image, like a still photograph or something like that. But we wouldn't, and at least I suggest we shouldn't call those dreaming. But dreaming is really something that happens, or something that makes us feel that we are inside a world. It's a being in the world experience, and it involves many kinds of sensory experiences, especially vision, but also hearing, touching, smelling, moving, tasting. All kinds of experiences are possible in dreams, and also dreams have this dynamic character, that they progress in time in a meaningful manner, that there are events or episodes. So they simulate entire episodes of life, we could say, or something happening. And usually it's ourselves who is in the center of that world. So there's a dream self and a dream world that surrounds us. So if that is the idea of what dreaming is, And now if dreaming actually as an experience, it's very close in its form to our waking consciousness. Just like lucid dreaming shows that inside a dream, we can ask the question that, is this a dream or is this happening for real? And why we ask that question is because it feels exactly the same as being awake. And that's why you can sometimes be fooled by the dream, even when you are asking the question, that you come up with the answer that this must be real because it feels so real. So then when we think about in what state is the brain during dreaming versus wakefulness or waking consciousness. So during dreaming, we have what we can call the sensory input blockade. So for example, even if you sleep with your eyes open, while you are dreaming, you wouldn't see the real world, you would still see your dream. There have been experiments actually where they taped the people's eyes open and then they were sleeping, and then the researchers showed some objects in front of the eyes, and it looks like the eyes are looking around, but actually they are not seeing what's out there, but they are seeing the dream world. And our muscles are paralyzed, so we cannot move. But if our muscles were not paralyzed, we would actually move according to the dream worlds, like what we are intending to do there. So from these facts, I then argued that this virtual reality, this world simulation that we have during dreaming, it's actually the same phenomenon that we have all the time during waking consciousness. But we could say that the same world simulation is in an offline state during dreaming, so it's cut off from sensory information and from motor action. It's offline, but it's simulating a world and being in a world. But when we are awake, it's online. So then we get, via our senses, we get lots of information, and this information modulates our consciousness so that what we dream about during wakefulness is the real world. So in consciousness, it is still a simulation, but it's a simulation that is coherent with what's actually out there in the real physical world. And when we act according to what we are conscious of, our actions are also coherent with the real physical world, so that we don't bump into objects or hurt ourselves, like the sleepwalkers and dream walkers. I mean, they really bump into the real world because they see another world in their consciousness. So that's the idea, basically, that we are always inside a world simulation, a virtual reality, but there are just these two states. Either it's offline while we're dreaming, or it's online while we are awake, but we are always dreaming in some sense.
So this idea contrasts with what's traditionally known as direct realism, where you believe that you're perceiving something that's out there, but this idea is what some might call as indirect realism, right? Where things are literally happening inside the head. And I think it was either in your book or I read somewhere else, where the furthest we see is the back of our head. We never sort of see beyond it, and it sounds a really crazy idea, but I think it's a perfect explanation, especially when you even account for things like hallucinations while you're awake, while you're awake, or even say psychedelic driven altered perception. I mean, there is no other way to explain that, because nothing's flying out there. It's happening if you've taken certain drugs inside your mind.
Exactly, yes. So in philosophy, we have these many theories of perception and action that they rely totally on the fact that somehow we have to be in real connection with the real physical world, both in perception and in action. That's what the theories build upon. And in my arguments, I try to argue against this, that, well, these theories can never explain dreaming, properly. So they just have to try to ignore dreaming, because there we have a fully conscious, vivid experience with also potential motor actions that have nothing to do with the current sensory environment. It's also this direct realism that you mentioned. I mean, that's kind of a philosophical theory, that we're in direct contact with the real physical world. And then also our intuitive understanding that most people have, which is often called naive realism. That's also the idea that, well, you open your eyes and you see the world somehow directly as it is. And you don't realize that what you actually see is a construction of your brain. But what makes it easier to accept that it must be a construction of your brain is, again, if you consider dreaming. Because now we know that, well, when you dream, when you dream, when you have a dream and you wake up from it, and it has been a really, really vivid dream, you have been in some place, maybe talked to some people, maybe having strong emotions, colorful scenery, and so forth. When you wake up, you realize, well, it didn't happen in the real world at all. It must have happened inside my head, inside my brain. So when you look around in the dream world, I mean, where is that world? I think the only scientific answer that we can give is that that world must somehow exist inside your brain. Even if you see like vast sceneries, you see other people going around in their business in that world, and somehow the whole world in the dream has been constructed by your brain, and you seem to be separate from that world. I mean, you are still standing in the center of a world that seems to surround your body, but yet all of that must somehow be happening inside your brain. And I had this concept in some of my articles that I said that dreaming and also consciousness actually creates for us an out of the brain experience, that we feel that we are here inside the world. We are not inside our brains, but actually that's a trick. That's a sort of an illusion, that our experiences always must happen inside the brain. Even, of course, when they are in the offline situation in dreaming, we can accept that. But even when we are online with the world, the information has to be streamed in and transformed or modulating our conscious experience of the world. So maybe that makes it a little bit easier to accept that in some sense we are always seeing the insides of our brain, or how external information is modulating the consciousness mechanisms inside our brain.
Yeah, I mean, it's so unintuitive. If you're on a mountain looking at a valley, all that physicality is happening inside your brain, which is maybe a couple of centimeters square cubed area, but those kilometers of view that you see, because your argument is that you could see the same thing in dreams, and obviously that vast vista doesn't exist anywhere but your head. And even while you're awake, the similar thing is happening. It's a strange and powerful idea, but I think a naive but an important question that arises is, if it's a simulation, say it's analogous to virtual reality, someone would ask, who's watching it? The homunculus question. So what's your response to it? I mean, is that even a valid question to ask, who's watching it? And if so, how do we answer it?
Yeah, I think it's a valid question, and it's an old question in the philosophy of perception and philosophy of consciousness. And I think I mean, we can get rid of that problem, because it already assumes that when you are inside pure consciousness, like in the dream world, that somehow if you are there centered in the dream world, that somehow you have some kind of dream eyes, and those dream eyes are somehow taking in some kind of signals from the dream world to be aware of it. But that's just copying the relationship of our physical brain, our physical eyes, to the physical world. I mean, of course, our physical eyes need to take in physical electromagnetic radiation as stimuli and transform them into neural signals. but that's not anything we experience directly. But when we are inside consciousness as such, there is no homunculus. What there is usually a self model or a simulation of our own bodies and our own location in this world. But even that is not necessary, because we know, again, from dream research, that it's possible to have a dream where there is no dream self, at least no explicit dream self. You can just dream about kind of like a scenery and some events in there, and you are just like an observer, kind of an abstract observer. Or even there are dreams where people have sort of a double perspective, that at the same time you are like someone in the dream, but you are also watching it from above or somewhere. So this perspective as such is not some kind of an active homunculus who needs to see the world. My suggestion and my theory is that consciousness as such, it's a sort of a unified world or space, and anything that happens in this space is already self-presenting. It's something that consciousness consists of as an experience, and you don't need a separate experiencer, so to speak, so that anything that enters consciousness is just experienced in the context of the whole space or world of consciousness, and there doesn't need to be a perceiver of that, because the qualia, the whatever consciousness consists of, is already as such self-presenting. It cannot even exist without being experienced and being felt. There is no perceiver and object relationship inside consciousness. It's just pure experience without perceivers and objects of perception.
So the clue is in definition itself, that consciousness is something which, I mean, it is. If it is to be perceived by something else, then it's not consciousness, perhaps. Whatever experience that we have, what you're saying is that experience is self-presenting. That's a definition of qualia. There is no experiencer needed for qualia, because otherwise we just maybe misunderstanding what qualia is.
Yeah, exactly. That in philosophy you would call the homunculus problem theories relational theories of consciousness. So you always need a relation between a perceiver and an object of perception. So there are like two poles to the relationship. And many theories take this for granted, that you always need to have a perceiver and an object of perception, and then you create consciousness from the relationship of that. But my theory is non-relational and self-presenting. And in my idea, I argue that consciousness is a separate level of organization in the brain, what I call the phenomenal level of organization, so that there is some higher level of organization of brain activity. And when anything enters that level, it becomes part of this self-presenting system. It cannot enter that without carrying or becoming some kind of qualitative experience. And the system as a whole is like the subject who is experiencing, so that when you experience a dream, you experience the whole scenery at one time, and there is not a separate experiencer, a person who is experiencing. It's just like, in some sense, you could say that the dream is experiencing itself, that you can be there as a dream self who is moving around and maybe commenting something, or it can be just a dream that happens and you experience it. But there is no separate you who needs to perceive it.
So the self, which I am, and when I see my hand, it's sort of like an object, like any other object, which is getting perceived, like a bottle or something else. It's nothing special about that.
Yeah, it's just another simulation that we have in the dream world. If we think about it, I mean, what I believe is the most fundamental aspect of consciousness is the spatial or spatiotemporal simulation, that you need to have a space and temporal progress. So that's the kind of context. And then into this space, there appear various qualia which are well organized, so that you have experiences of objects, of scenery, of other people, and including a simulation of yourself. But they are all simulations. So as well as you see someone else in your dream, and it looks like that person is maybe like the real person in the real world, but of course you are just seeing a simulation. But your own body is also just a simulation of your physical body. So it's not, I mean, it's the same kind of simulation that our bodies are as experienced also during wakefulness. And we know this from some strange experiences during wakefulness, like out-of-body experiences, or people who have amputated limbs, they still feel these phantom limbs, because the body as we experience it, it's not out there in the flesh and bones. It's some kind of simulation created inside the brain. And that's the body that we feel both during wakefulness and during dreaming. And that simulation is not even necessary for the rest of consciousness to exist, so that we can have experiences where there is no obvious self. We have that in dreams, and then people often describe their like mystical experiences or deep meditation experiences. There are these concepts of ego dissolution and oneness and things like that. And these are also experiences where there is no self and no simulation of your body involved. It's just some kind of a unified experience. So we know that the self is one simulation among others, and it's not necessary to have the rest of the simulation happening and being experienced.
Right. So in your book, you talk about consciousness as a biological phenomena. So why do you stress on this phrase biological phenomena? I mean, is there any other way to explain it but biologically?
Yeah, well, what I'm defending there is a particular philosophical position that is consistent what we call emergent materialism, or weak emergent materialism, which means that consciousness, or that's what I believe, that if we want to place consciousness into the framework of the biological sciences, that the best strategy is to treat it like we treat other higher level, highly complex biological phenomena. And we know that these kinds of biological phenomena, like basically being alive itself, that was really hard to explain. Still 150 years ago, people had no idea how is it possible that by putting together dead bits of matter, that somehow you can create life out of that. But there was still these ideas that you need to add some kind of a life force, some kind of a dualistic soul into matter, so that in order to make it alive. But now we know that it's just this enormous complexity of the biological organization that can make single cells be alive, in a sense that molecules are not alive. So the same strategy is that to explain consciousness is that in the brain there are several higher levels of organization that we haven't really discovered yet, and one of those levels corresponds exactly to what we experience. So that's the dream world and the world of consciousness, or the phenomenal level of organization. And to explain it, we need to really discover many of the underlying levels that we actually don't know, and science doesn't know them yet. And that was also the case in biology, that when we didn't understand how life comes about, there was no actual molecular biology, and there was no like proper genetics, and nobody knew what the DNA molecule does, or what exactly is going on inside cells and cell organelles, and all of that was unknown. But when we were able to understand these lower levels of organization, then it became kind of self-evident. We could derive how and why entire organisms are alive. How does a single cell become alive? So my explanatory strategy is basically to argue that when we discover many new higher levels of organization in the brain, among them we will find a level of organization that actually resembles consciousness or has the same kind of spatial and temporal structure as consciousness has, so that we can see that, hey, here is a phenomenon that looks pretty much exactly like what that person is currently experiencing. So if we can find that kind of a level of organization that has the same structure as consciousness, then we can argue that, well, we have now discovered precisely those neural phenomena or maybe bioelectrical phenomena that constitute consciousness. But if we never find such a thing there, then we are in trouble. Then we have to find some kind of a different type of, philosophical theory. But what I'm trying to do is to argue for that consciousness could be explained with the same strategy as we explained other highly complex biological phenomena.
Okay. So to capture what you're saying, let me try to put in my words if I've gotten this right. So you're saying there is a level, there should be a level of organization in brain, and by level of organization you mean, for example, one level is simply neurons where they're connected, and perhaps that's the most basic we're aware of. Maybe there is something, even subneuronal process that's going with, we don't know, but let's take neurons as the basic fundamental unit. So some level of structure comprising of neurons or groups of neurons or some structure of neurons where there is one-to-one correspondence between what's happening in consciousness and what's happening on that structure. So if I see a ball in my consciousness, there must be something spherical going. Obviously not a ball inside my brain, but some mathematical structure perhaps that resembles that sphere. Is that the argument that you're making?
Yeah, there needs to be some sort of isomorphism between some objective level of organization in the brain and what is the structure of experience. Because if we say that consciousness is inside the brain and that conscious experiences have a certain spatial and temporal structure, then what we are saying is that spatial and temporal structure must exist somehow at some level in the brain. Otherwise, if we deny that, then we are either saying that consciousness is not inside the brain, or we are saying that we are under some kind of illusion that consciousness actually doesn't have the structure and the dynamics as we believe it has, that somehow our reports of our experiences are fundamentally misguided. That would be the Dennettian argument. But if consciousness has the structure that it has and seems to have, and the temporal dynamics that our experiences seem to have, then there must be something in the brain that has those features, because anything that is consciousness in the brain must have the structure of consciousness in the brain.
Right. So I wanted to dig deeper into this isomorphism point, because it's so fascinating. Doesn't that require us to have a good structure of phenomenal world as well? So if I'm, for example, smelling chocolate fragrance, I can't even imagine what would it be isomorphic to when it comes to mathematical object. And I can understand about spheres, but a lot of other things, colors, sounds, I'm not sure if they have a good structure in themselves, which seems like a prerequisite if we have to do that one-to-one isomorphism.
Yeah. So now, of course, what exactly do we mean by structure? We actually have a lot of data about the structure of phenomenology. If you take, for example, the branch of experimental psychology called psychophysics. So it has been mapping for over a century, like since Fechner's time. It has been mapping like the similarities and differences between different experiences, and sort of trying to map what is the spectrum, the potential spectrum of different experiences in vision and well, in olfaction, in any sensory modality, so that when you change the stimulation, then do you get a different experience, or do you experience two different stimuli as the same experience? So we have these kinds of psychophysical kind of like maps of the whole spectrum of experience. So one way to understand that would be to say that, okay, so if we take this, like these kinds of maps, then we have to find a level of organization that has the same resolution, so to speak, that it can actually carry out or realize the same spectrum of experiences as what our psychophysical experiments have shown that we are capable of experiencing. So that would be a sort of a structural correspondence between the space of experiences that we have mapped and the space of some kind of neural phenomena that can have different kinds of states, a sort of a resolution map, we could say. Then, of course, there are these like single experiences that of course we also need to somehow be able to map into what's going on in consciousness. But I would say that maybe it's easier to start with these kinds of more universal maps. But of course we can also take a single experience, like let's say that you look at the traffic lights and there are these three colors like red and yellow and green, and they shift, and maybe you can have a dream where you are staring at a traffic light and they also shift red, yellow, green. So there has to be, I mean, there's a certain spatial structure that the lights are round and they are spatially organized, one above the other, and there's a temporal sequence that one light goes on and the other one goes off. So somehow this spatial and temporal structure needs to be also, there needs to be some kind of correspondence at the level of consciousness, at the level of those parts of the brain that constitute consciousness, where we can find these correspondences. But of course, now what I'm talking about, they are these kind of structural and the dynamical temporal correspondences. And now the question that arises that even if we can find these kind of like structural correspondences, does that yet capture the qualia? I mean, it might capture the relationships between different qualia, but not really describe the intrinsic character of what it feels like to have those qualia. And that's a valid point. And I have argued also in inner presence that actually to capture this qualitative feature, the qualitative character of experience, just like any scientific data, we need to have the right kind of device to represent that data, so that if we want to really observe, so to speak, what another person is experiencing by measuring consciousness from that person's brain, then we actually need to use our own brain to look at that data. So we have to simulate consciousness inside another consciousness. And that's just what we do with other scientific data as well. So that if you model some very complicated, let's say like three-dimensional protein molecules, I mean, you don't write down just like some kind of chemical equation, because nobody can really understand what is the three-dimensional structure of a complex protein molecule by looking at that. But you make a computer simulation and you you can circulate around the molecule and see what the three-dimensional structure of the protein is, and maybe how it can interlock with other molecules and so forth. So you need to kind of translate the data into a form that respects the nature of the phenomenon. In a more simple form, we can say that, well, if you have a scientific model of the planet Earth, if you make a two-dimensional map, it always distorts the reality, as we know. I mean, if you project the map, then you distort something. I mean, some countries look much bigger than they are in reality, and there is an edge that doesn't exist in reality. So you need to represent a three-dimensional planet as a sphere. Otherwise, you will always distort something. So the same goes with consciousness. You have to represent the data inside another phenomenal level in another consciousness, and only then you can get the qualitative features into the structures of consciousness, and that's how you, in a way, you need to use other consciousness to understand the consciousness that you want to model.
So by explanation of consciousness, then what you're saying, we need, I mean, like all good theories, we need a model of a phenomenon, and the more sort of the richer the model is in terms of explaining the data, the better it is. And in this sense, the model is nothing but that level of structure that you're talking about. But unless that model is predictive in the sense of actually recreating the qualia it would be representing, it only then sort of it'll be satisfactory as an explanation if it can sufficiently recreate qualia in, say, someone else.
Yes, and another aspect why I argued for this kind of that you need to represent the data in the appropriate domain so that you won't distort it or leave something out. Just like the two-dimensional map of the planet Earth. I mean, it's not really a planet. It's a flat surface, and that's not really what the planet is like at all. So in the same way, if you represent the structure of consciousness somehow outside of consciousness, you also see a sort of a two-dimensional map of consciousness, but you don't see the qualia, and therefore you need to engage another consciousness that simulates the original consciousness. And I have a thought experiment about this in my book, which I call the Dreamcatcher experiment. So there the idea is that we can actually make consciousness, in a sense, objectively observable. And that can be also a test as to when we have found the right level of organization in the brain, so that when we acquire data from high-level, very complex neuroelectrical, neurophysiological phenomena in the brain, and when we find the level that actually carries the and realizes the phenomenal level, then how we should look at that data is to transform the data so that we simulate the same state of the brain in the observer's brain, in the scientist's brain. And then the scientist can not only see the structure of consciousness, but also the qualia, because their own brain can recreate the qualia, or at least a sufficiently close resemblance to those qualia that the subject had. And if this is possible, consciousness becomes, in a sense, objectively observable, because now you can do just like with any other scientific observation. I mean, if you're an astronomer and you look with your telescope and you see a new supernova in the sky, and then you call your fellow astronomer, say, hey, there is a supernova, please take a look into your telescope, can you see the same thing? Or if you are a cell biologist and you look at a sample of tissue in the microscope and you see something exciting, something new, and then you tell your biologist friends, okay, look into your microscopes. Can you see the same thing as I see? So now you can also share consciousness. So let's say we are recording this data from people who are dreaming. And then we want to know what exactly did they experience during their dream. So the data is being used to modulate our own consciousness so that we can have the same dream, so to speak, have the same dream experiences in some sort of an like maybe a dreamlike state, that we are ourselves in a dreamlike state while we have it. And when we come out from this simulation, then we can say, okay, now I know what the qualities were in that dream. And you can call your fellow neuroscientists or consciousness researchers. So now I have this very exciting dream that our subjects had. Please go into your own simulator and look at that same dream. Then you know what it really felt like or what the experience was like. So we can share experiences just like we share any other scientific data, and therefore we can, in that sense, we can objectively observe the same phenomenon. And that observation would not be really different from different people looking into their own telescope or into their own microscopes. Because still there is, every time a scientist makes an observation, it's also a subjective perception of something that always happens in a scientist's own mind. So that's my argument, how we can make consciousness to be at the same level of being objectively observable as other natural phenomena.
Yeah, and I found your Dreamcatcher thought experiment fascinating, and I was wondering if you use such a device in a different species altogether, say a bird, they apparently sense ultraviolet, or maybe bats coming to the Nagel's famous experiment, what it's to feel like a bat who uses echolocation. So what's your sense where there is actually a difference in qualia? We try to visualize. Do you think this can be used in different species where we try to experience what they must feel like, and where would that experience even come from? Say the experience of ultraviolet.
Yeah, right. So yeah, I do believe that we can use it also in other species. And now the question is, and I think we need to remind ourselves that when we are using scientific models, I mean that's what we are basically doing. We are always modeling data. So when we look at molecules circling around on our computer screens as a three-dimensional simulation, or when someone says that now we have a direct photograph of a black hole, yeah, or that we have mapped the density of dark matter in the universe, or how the galaxies are in some superclusters. I mean, of course, we are not actually seeing directly those phenomena. We see some patterns of stuff on our computer screens that represent some phenomenon, and these are models, scientific models, and they are never 100% accurate. So now what we can ask is that if we have this kind of a dream catcher that simulates other people's consciousness in our own consciousness, or maybe other species' consciousness, so we can ask how close to the original can this scientific model come to? And of course, it's not 100%, but how good is it when we are maybe talking about another human being that has mostly the same kind of sensory apparatus and phenomenological spectrum of experiences? Then we can maybe say that it's quite accurate. And in my argument, I also have this further idea that when we are simulating another person's or even another animal's consciousness, we should do that in a state which is resembling something like REM sleep, dreaming. Because we know from REM sleep dreaming that consciousness is actually very flexible there. We can have all kinds of experiences during dreams that we have never had during wakefulness. I mean, we can fly around, we can have a different kind of body, we can see weird scenery, weird things, weird monsters, maybe even stranger things. And of course, people who have undergone, let's say, like psychedelic experiences, they also, or mystical experiences, they often say that they cannot even verbally describe those experiences. So obviously our brain is very flexible. It has a very rich variety of experiences that it's capable of generating. And now if we can somehow, in a controlled manner, tap all this spectrum of experiences and modulate our own consciousness so that it would model another person's or another animal's consciousness, I believe that we can get quite close to what it feels like to be that other person or that other animal. And now, for example, the bat case, I mean, it has been argued that, yeah, like you said, ultraviolet, we don't sense that. And of course, bats have this echolocation system that we also lack. But now, of course, we are talking about the external physical stimuli that are different. We don't know how the bat's echolocation system, into what kind of phenomenology does it translate. We could well imagine that because it is sort of a radar system, that how the bat actually experiences its echolocation, it's like a radar screen that it, when it's kind of like scanning the environment with this ultrasound and it gets echoes back, what it actually experiences is sort of visual spatial space, and then these insects flying around are like beep blips moving in a radar screen. And then when it looks at the delicious blip, it goes for it and tries to catch it. So it can be actually translated into some kind of visual spatial experience that makes pretty good sense for our experiences, even if we don't have this physical echolocation. But I mean, we shouldn't confuse the physical stimuli with the phenomenology. It's possible that ultraviolet or echolocation is translated into similar phenomenological experiences in bats, like what we could experience in some kind of visual spatial colors and motions in our own consciousness. So I'm optimistic. But
that's a beautiful point. Yeah. I mean, I had not considered that, and now you pointed out it's, I think, obvious that could be happening. I mean, ultraviolet, for all we know, could just be seen like some sort of animations or some other way, similarly in the visual field. I guess, I'm a bit of brainwashed where in Nat Geo or Discovery Channel, they show why ultraviolet cameras a different color altogether. And they talk about that this is something we can't even visualize. But I think you're absolutely right. Maybe the phenomenological space could be just constant across species.
Yeah, exactly. And also that we might have a wider repertoire of colors than we have normally. I mean, like these psychedelic experiences, people sometimes do report that they had, for example, color experiences that they have never had before. So maybe there is more potential for the brain to create colors that we have never seen. But we shouldn't confuse. I mean, this is a very, very common confusion, again, with this kind of a sort of like this direct and naive realism that we somehow, even the language confuses, because we talk about red and blue and yellow wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation. But of course, electromagnetic radiation and the photons, they have no colors. I mean, they are not painted with yellow and red and blue as experiential colors. They are just different wavelengths. Has nothing to do with our experiences directly. So it's a confused way of talking about, and somehow assumes this direct realism that somehow we see directly certain electromagnetic radiation wavelengths, and then we don't see others, and therefore we cannot experience those colors. But I mean, everything physical is always translated first to neural impulses, and those neural impulses are translated to phenomenology. And that translation is the critical. How do you translate some neural impulses to phenomenological distinctions? And what distinctions are being used? And we don't know what the bat is using, what the bat brain is using, what phenomenological distinctions. Maybe it has not that different repertoire as what we have.
Yeah. So coming back to the question of multi-level explanations within the brain or multiple levels of structure. So I was curious what makes one level experienceable, but other levels not experienceable. So what's so special about a level that it gets converted into qualia?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, that goes into the heart of the hard problem or the explanatory gap, that what is the kind of a magic ingredient there. And my own answer there is that why it looks so mysterious and so magical, that if we take this idea in emergent materialism seriously, is that that how it was solved in explaining what life is, it was that we discovered so many underlying levels of organization that gradually build upon each other. And actually the borderline between what is alive and what are just dead pieces of matter, it's kind of gradual. That we have like microbes which are not really independently alive, and we have like DNA molecules that can make copies of each other, but of course not as such, but as part of the machinery in cells. So we have to understand all these multiple levels and their interactions to understand how living organisms work. And my idea is that consciousness will turn out to be similar, that there are many different levels of organization, and my argument has been that because I believe that this spatio-temporal context in which consciousness happens, so this kind of like why it always feels like we are inside a world when we are conscious, that it's a world simulation, that the underlying level of organization just below qualitative consciousness, it needs to be some sort of a spatio-temporal representation. That space is really fundamental. I mean, experience of space is really fundamental for consciousness. But we never experience space as such. We always experience a structured world of qualia. So I have argued that there is this like this spatial and spatio-temporal representation, and that is the critical like stepping stone from the unconscious levels to the conscious levels. And we see that also in some neuropsychological deficits like neglect. So neglect is actually a very common neurological syndrome with right hemisphere damage, parietal right hemisphere damage, and the patients lose the idea of left-sided space. Okay. And they cannot be aware of anything in the left side, and they cannot actually even understand that there is space there. They only see the right side of space. And when they are presented with objects in the left side, they behave as if those don't exist, even though their visual cortex is okay. So they should be still processing all the visual information, but there is just no space inside the brain, I mean the space of phenomenology, to put those objects into that, to become conscious of them. So I believe that the brain first builds this space, and the qualities can only exist when they enter this space. And that's why we have this kind of a world simulation. And it has also a functional explanation that why this is a space or a spatio-temporal simulation, that this simulation of the world that exists in consciousness, this is where actually our behavior, a lot of our behavior, the voluntary part of our behavior is determined. That when something becomes part of consciousness, then we can interrelate that object or that percept with so much more information. We can relate it to our previous memories, we can relate it to our goals, we can relate it to our emotional responses, our plans, our intentions to behave in a certain way. We can make like voluntary decisions between courses of action and so forth. Whereas information that is processed unconsciously or non-consciously, it usually guides behavior in a much more like reflex-like manner, that an isolated manner. I mean, we can see this also in other neurological patients that have, for example, blind sight, and whose behavior is guided by unconscious information. So it's very rigid and obviously doesn't take into account all this information that we can take into account in consciousness. So I believe that this space of experience is needed to bring a lot of information together, and somehow it has to be in this common language of qualities. When it is in this common language of qualities in a shared space, then the brain can make decisions what course of action to choose, what trajectory to choose in this simulation. So that if there is an object that we know is dangerous, we choose a trajectory that goes away from that.
Yeah.
If there is some attractive object, we can choose a trajectory that goes towards it. If there is a very complicated scenery that involves both like rewarding and dangerous stimuli, then we need to really make plans as to how to proceed and to consult like our memories and what we have learned in previous situations and so forth. So this kind of a simulation is very much needed. It's necessary for flexible, integrated, voluntary, like the highest level kinds of behavioral guidance that we can do.
And this also sort of explain why this would have been recruited by evolution, because it should serve a purpose for increasing fitness of the organism. And this simulation's almost, I mean, the way you're describing it, it feels like simulation is this multidimensional object that the brain uses to look at reality from multiple angles, so that the decision could be faster, more efficient, cost effective, and so on, versus if the information was just structureless, unrelated, the organism would have just gotten eaten already.
Yeah, exactly. That it really enables behaviors or maybe decisions before we behave, before we choose to behave in a certain way. It enables very complex decision making that takes into account multiple sources of information and then integrates it into a single behavioral strategy or trajectory, which would not be possible unconsciously or non-consciously. And we see this in these cases of neurological patients who can still have responses towards objects, but unconsciously. And these responses are very rigid and isolated and often not very functional either. And now the question is about animal consciousness, that, well, maybe many animals actually, maybe they function with this kind of what has also been called zombie systems in the brain. So the zombie systems are capable of very complex information processing and guiding behavior, but they usually only take into account a very limited amount of information, and then result in a sort of a little bit reflex-like, very rigid responses, usually also very fast responses, maybe protective responses. So to what extent are many animals actually capable of guiding their behavior purely by such zombie-like mechanisms? I mean, if we take something like a fly that flies around, and I mean, if it gets inside your house, it will never, I mean, it will bump into the window like a million times, because it obviously has no memory, so it doesn't kind of realize that, okay, there is the open window that I came into, so it has to be there still. And it doesn't have a concept of a transparent object like a window, and it doesn't learn that you can't get through it if you tried already 100 times, so it will never. But if you darken all the windows and there is just the open window where the light comes, so it's like a light guided missile that goes out from. So that's exactly the kind of functions that the zombie system could guide. It can guide you towards light, just like the blindside subjects. They say, I don't see anything. Okay, but guess where is the light? And then their finger can actually point to where the light is. And they say, well, I'm just guessing, I have no idea. But we can see that they are pointing exactly at the right direction. So that makes one wonder how many animals actually are pure zombies. They have no consciousness. They have a very sophisticated collection of zombie systems in the brain that can guide their behavior in this kind of automatic manner by connecting certain types of stimuli with certain types of even complex behaviors. But when evolution came up with consciousness, and I don't know where or when it happened, but I would say that at least the mammalian brain, like our brain, probably all mammals share quite similar basic neuroanatomy and neurophysiology. Maybe also birds, but it's difficult to say like about then other animals further back in evolution. But at least mammals and birds, I would say, they probably have this capacity to combine in their brain multiple sources of information in ways that require this world simulation. So I would say this phenomenal level of organization, and guide much more complicated behavioral trajectories than what can be guided by these unconscious zombie systems.
Right. So the value of consciousness from an evolutionary point of view is to integrate a lot of information for better decision making on the organism's part. Okay. Since we are at the end of our time, I wanted to just ask one last question, and it's regarding panpsychism. There is a resurgence of interest into this idea, and it almost makes the hard problem disappear, wherein there is nothing to explain, everything is conscious. And I do think you reject the idea in your book. So I'm curious, what makes you reject it? Why don't you sort of ascribe to the idea that every physical thing could be an experience in itself?
Well, it's of course in principle it's possible, but it's a purely metaphysical speculation, and I cannot see any way in which we could empirically really test it. I mean, I would be happy to go where the evidence goes, but if there isn't even in principle a way to test it, that's already one reason to reject it as a scientific hypothesis. But then I also think that it, in a way, it also ignores or gets rid of the real problem on the cheap. Because I think the real problem arose in cases where we contrast typical states of the absence of consciousness with the presence of consciousness. So if you take a person who is in a deep coma, or who is undergoing deep general anesthesia, or who is in the deepest stages of non-REM sleep, or in some other types of complete lack of consciousness, complete absence of consciousness. And then we contrast that with cases of complete presence of consciousness, like vivid dreaming in REM sleep, or our waking consciousness. I mean, that was the original problem. How does the brain do it?
Yeah.
You wake up from coma, you wake up from dreamless sleep, or dreamless sleep turns into vivid dreaming. What happens in the brain? That's the real problem. How does that wonderful, colorful phenomenology come about? And now if you claim that that's not the problem, really, because everything is conscious all the time, I think that's really not actually that different from Dennett's idea that consciousness doesn't exist at all. Because if you say that consciousness is nowhere, it doesn't exist at all, or if you say that consciousness is everywhere, they are somehow similar strategies, because they get rid of these interesting empirical contrasts that we wanted to really understand. How does a non-conscious brain turn on its lights inside and turn on this colorful phenomenology? And neither of these ideas can answer that question. Yeah. They start to go into, like panpsychism, it goes into, I don't know, some quantum mechanics or some conscious diodes or conscious, very simple systems, conscious atoms, whatever. So it starts to look at phenomena that are kind of irrelevant from the biological perspective, irrelevant from the cognitive neuroscience perspective, from the original problem between what is the relationship between brain and consciousness. And that's the problem where I want to keep the focus on. And I think that panpsychism takes the focus totally elsewhere and into a metaphysical speculation that cannot be empirically tested and that doesn't answer the interesting empirical questions.
Right. Okay. So thank you so much, Professor Revonsuo. It was a pleasure talking to you. We covered a lot, and I highly recommend everyone listening to this to go and read your book, Inner Presence. It's the perspective that you give about consciousness from a biological perspective. I think it's a refreshing break from a lot of mystical and metaphysical hypotheses which are hard to test, and yours being grounded into very scientific way of understanding consciousness. I think it's very enjoyable. So thank you again for taking time out for talking to me, and I hope you have a great week ahead.
Thank you very much for your excellent and interesting questions, and it was a great pleasure and honor to discuss these with you, and I hope the audience also enjoyed.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.